Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications, and your podcast co-host. This week, we're about 7 months or so from the outbreak of the destructive Southern California wildfires that destroyed the communities of the Palisades and the Eaton area in January. And it's natural now that there's been some separation of time that we begin to look back on what went right, what went wrong, what are the lessons from these wildfires, and what were the policy-created problems that we can address going forward. And PRI has a new Free City Center booklet on the wildfires that is going to be coming out soon, and we'll be talking with our Stephen Greenhut soon about what he found about the lessons from the wildfires by way of policy. But this week we have terrific young reporter for the Center Square, Kenneth Schrupp. Kenneth also writes for PRI's Free City Center occasionally, and he's been doing a lot of reporting recently on issues related to the wildfires. In fact, he grew up, his childhood home was just blocks away from some of the worst destruction of the wildfires. And we talk with Kenneth about some of the mistakes, things like the lack of brush clearing and the debates now that are being had about the rebuilding process and is government trying to impose its vision in the rebuilding process in the area. We also talk about some of the other issues that Kenneth has been following in his reporting, like high-speed rail, the aftermath of the LA ice riot, a federal judge who is becoming increasingly frustrated over how LA is ineffectively spending homeless dollars. So it's a very interesting, wide-ranging discussion with Kenneth, and I think you'll enjoy it. So stay tuned. After this message, Matt Fleming and I will have a terrific conversation with Kenneth Schrupp. Thanks for listening. We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. Well, Kenneth, it's great to have you on Next Round Podcast.
Hey, Tim, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
So our readers have enjoyed reading your work, occasional work that you do for us at the Free Cities Center, and your great writing with Center Square. And so it's great to be able to chat with you a little bit here about some of your recent reporting. And you've been doing a lot, not presently, given your proximity to it, of the January's destructive Southern California wildfires. And, our listeners may not realize why this issue is so important to you. You actually grew up right near where the fires burnt. So maybe before we dive into all of the things you've been reporting, paint the picture for us. Just how close to where you grew up did the fires burn, and what did you and your family experience in January?
So thankfully, my childhood home did not burn, but it did get within a block or two of my former home. You can still see houses in Google Maps that were completely flattened just a few hundred feet away. Those are currently being cleared, I assume rebuilt. But a lot of people in the community did lose their homes. My church burned down. It really is the loss of the Palisades as I knew it. The community, of course, has been changing in recent years and has been so for some time. But naturally, a lot of residents are very concerned about, well, what has the state done to make sure things like this won't happen again, what measures weren't taken, and what is going to happen with the Palisades moving forward as all of this money comes in to rebuild, or perhaps in the words of state legislators and officials, reimagine what the Palisades will be like. This is a comfortable coastal community governed by the city of Los Angeles, but sufficient distance away from many of the city's troubles.
Of course, we always shudder when you hear the word reimagine, kind of like the Ronald Reagan line, I'm from the government and we're here to help.
Yes, exactly. That does seem to be the case.
So we're what? We're roughly 7 months from the fires breaking out, and we're now
Hmm.
looking back to see what mistakes were made by the government. And it looks like a lot of them were made. The wildfires were so much more destructive than they needed to be. And we're hoping that the government will learn from its mistakes and do things differently in the future. You wrote a terrific story for Center Square recently where you looked at a key issue in this and other wildfires, and that's lack of brush clearing in the Palisades by state officials, as our president would say, raking the forest or what is sweeping the forest. And this funny,
Yes. Yeah.
it's actually the sentiment of what he's trying to say is actually quite right. And what you found was rather troubling. If you will, share your reporting with our listeners. What's been the response, if any, from state officials since your article went live? And do you have any confidence the state is going to do things better in the future?
Hey, Matt, let's go back a little bit and actually explain what that story was first. I did go through the entire database for the California Department of Forestry and Fire Prevention on its brush clearance operations that it funded. This database includes the past 2 years, and I found that they only did one brush clearance operation in the Pacific Palisades. And this was for a very small area for just one small part of a fire road. This is just, a few hundred feet on either side of this fire road for just also a few hundred feet. So this is a very small part of the entire town, which really did leave most of the area unprotected. Just for geographic reference, we have the Pacific Ocean on the west, the Pacific Palisades, and then Brentwood, and then the major highway, the 405 that runs north to south, and then the rest of the city. The Cal Fire brush clearance operation did create a fire break or do some brush clearance on the demarcation between the Pacific Palisades and Brentwood, which probably did help the fire be contained because that is where it stopped burning. However, this operation that left the Palisades exposed but protected Brentwood and the rest of the city has left a lot of residents wondering why more work wasn't done, especially given the relatively low cost of brush clearance compared to the extremely high cost of the fires. These fires are estimated, these January fires that is, to cost the economy about $250 billion. That's the analysis or assessment from the UCLA Anderson School of Management. Meanwhile, brush clearance costs for the entire state are in the tens of billions of dollar range. I've seen estimates regarding just the wildlife urban interface, that last couple hundred feet between the wildlands and where people live, would only cost about $5 billion, while clearing all of California's lands at high risk for wildfire would cost $17 billion. This means that with just a few years of the state's greenhouse gas reduction fund being used, we could probably end up without having any uncontrolled wildfires. And evidence of this is this 2020 Silverado fire. It was about half the size of the Palisades fire, but while the Palisades fire lost thousands of structures and there were dozens of deaths, this Silverado fire had no deaths and only 5 structures were lost because there was very strict brush clearance done by Orange County. This was just the same kind of chaparral that you saw in the coastal Pacific Palisades. Silverado fire was in coastal Orange County, but Orange County and the local government were very serious about making sure the last couple hundred feet between people's houses and the brush was cleared out. And what burned was just that inland brushland where nobody lived, and that kept everyone safe. You don't even have to clear out every single at-risk acre so long as that last bit between where people live and where the forest is cleared out.
So, improved brush clearing, of course, is not a new issue that the state has faced.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that poor brush clearing efforts have worsened the firefighting conditions for other recent wildfires across the state. Yet,
Mm-hmm.
it hasn't really been a top priority for the Newsom administration. Surprise, surprise, despite the lip service they've given the issue. And our listeners may recall, a few years back, Capitol Public Radio caught them red-handed for not doing what they said they would do with regard to their wildfire prevention project. So it kind of begs the question, and maybe you can help our listeners understand this. With such a focus on fighting climate change and emissions, you'd think that proper brush clearance and forest management would be an urgent priority, yet it doesn't seem to be. Why is that, do you think?
So remember we had these awful wildfires in 2018, and it was one of the worst fire seasons we'd ever had. It turns out that those 2018 wildfires had released more carbon dioxide than all of the really hundreds of billions of dollars that have been spent in the state on reducing carbon emissions. That's including, private investment, state investment, federal investment. And it really goes to show if we're not even doing any major brush clearance, just having any kind of regular fires like we're doing is going to wipe out all of the supposed climate benefits of this hundreds of billions of dollars that we've spent. And no, the governor does not seem to be very serious about increasing brush clearance to the extent that it's necessary. The Assembly Minority Leader, James Gallagher, he noted that this year we've only got about $200 million dedicated towards wildfire prevention. That's compared to a record $321 billion budget. This is an order of magnitude less than the actual cost of these fires, right? We have the 2018 fires, I believe, were expected to have cost about $150 billion. These January fires are another $250 billion. And yet we're not spending any minimal amount of state money to prevent these enormous losses. Meanwhile, we're having record state budgets. Things are just not adding up.
Things are just not adding up is a perfect way to describe so many policy outcomes in California. But so one of the lessons we learned from the Lahaina fires in Maui in 2023 was the heavy hand of Hawaii's government in trying to steer the rebuilding vision to what government bureaucrats and elected officials want to see, not necessarily what residents and business owners looking to rebuild desired. There's been a lot of controversy recently with how the Newsom administration and local officials are taking a similar tack in their efforts to try and shape the rebuilding to fit their vision, specifically when it comes to low-income housing. What's going on here, and what have you found in your reporting?
Well, just as an initial aside, I'll note that Mayor Karen Bass had officials from Lahaina to share their experience rebuilding and provide lessons for Los Angeles moving forward. She celebrated this in a social media post last week. So if there's any indication of what the mayor is expecting to do or where she's getting advice, look no further. But going back to your question of low-income housing, let's at first provide some basic definitions for our listeners. When we talk about, or when normal residents talk about affordable housing, they are thinking about housing that people can afford. They're not thinking that affordable housing means a government term usually relating to deed-restricted housing, where if you make over a certain amount of money, you're not allowed to live there. And this kind of covenant that's in effect for a very long time really comes with extremely high costs for developers. We know that inclusionary zoning that requires quote unquote affordable housing, we should just call it income restricted housing, reduces housing production more than it does create protected units. So everybody is paying the difference between the market rate and what is allowed to be charged to affordable units. The entire policy is an objective failure. But now that we've gotten that definition and sort of history of inclusionary zoning out of the way, we need to look at what is happening in the Palisades. There's a confluence of state and local law requiring, generally, of course there are exemptions that can be made, that any protected housing includes any housing that is rent controlled, or has been occupied by any lower income tenants in the last 5 years. If you can't prove who lived there in the last 5 years, they're going to assume a similar portion of incomes of renters based on the larger area. So you're going to end up with some very interesting estimates of how many low-income people lived in these apartments in the Palisades. And then you have these local ordinances. The city of Los Angeles has this replacement ordinance sort of modeled on state law requiring that all rent-controlled housing units in high and moderate opportunity areas be replaced with units that are affordable to low-income households. If we're going to get past the legalese here, that means, all rent-controlled units in the Palisades, pretty much. That's every apartment in Los Angeles built before October 1st, 1978, has to be replaced with low-income housing, even if the family that was there was paying somewhere near market rate and it was a moderate or higher income household. A lot of people choose to live in the Palisades, and they'll rent these older units because that's all there is there. We honestly don't build very much. And these people will not be able to come back to their homes or come back to where their old building was because of these low income requirements. And Governor Newsom did sign an exemption from the state replacement law that protected units be replaced with more affordable units. However, that exemption order included a carve out saying, well, this exemption doesn't override any local ordinances. Lo and behold, the city of Los Angeles has a local ordinance, which was modeled on state law that it just passed in February. These drafts have been swirling around for a while. I'm guessing they passed it to meet their regional housing needs allocation requirements because they're not building enough housing. So at the very least, they can adopt some really strict language that the city will use to try to get waivers from the state. That's just my guess. I don't really that is just my guess of what's happening here. But as it stands, that is what's going to be required. This the entire Pacific Palisades is a higher opportunity area. So pretty much, as far as I know, most of those apartments in the Palisades that burned down will have to be replaced with low income housing.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week. Speaking fears of, a repeat of the Lahaina experience, there's a very controversial piece of state legislation this year. It's Senate Bill 549 by Senator Ben Allen, and it would create a so-called Resilient Rebuilding Authority. I'd love to know, the consultants that come up with these names for these things. And the purpose of this rebuilding authority would be to engage in the rebuilding process in the areas affected by the wildfires. And eventually, because of the controversy surrounding it, Senator Allen put the bill on hold for this year in response to concerns from the community. So explain to our listeners, what exactly this bill would do. And, I guess sort of begs the question too, why do we need such a rebuilding authority in the first place? If everyone's talking about we want to get rid of bureaucracy and help you streamline the building process, well, why do you need another bureaucracy here? And going forward, what's the aftermath? Is Senator Allen talking about making changes to the legislation? What do you see as its prospects going forward?
Right. So SB 549 is a existing bill where an additional provision for this Resilient Rebuilding Authority was injected late in the legislative process because there was no time to create a separate bill. Unfortunately, the attention over the Resilient Rebuilding Authority also brought up the contents of the original bill, which also would have resulted in some fairly major changes to pretty much all municipalities in the state should they wish to use its language. Backing up a bit, this first section of the bill, the original one, would have created tax increment financing options where the municipalities would be able to take out bonds against future property tax growth from building these projects that would result in increased property tax growth. So they're able to say, look, we want to build these projects and we're going to see a lot of property tax values increase as a result. So we're just going to take that money now to go rebuild that. You get to have some tax advantage municipal bonds finance this. All is fine and dandy for the municipality because they get new money without having to actually have built the projects yet. The issue here is what would would this tax increment financing have been, and what kind of projects would it build? Well, this tax increment financing would have required that 40% of that funding would have to be used for housing that's affordable to households making less than 60% of area median income, with half of that for housing that's affordable to households making less than 30% of area median income or who are homeless, with another 10% set aside for beautification. And these projects have to be built within half a mile of a major transit stop. So this other half of the funding, interestingly enough, can be used to fund transit. So this would create a system where you can fund transit stops and build more low-income housing next to the transit stops. So you can fund more transit stops and build more low-income housing using tax increment financing. And that really changes your property tax base from, homeowners to the very profitable developers of these affordable housing projects. So you see the tax burden shift from, someone who buys a house, gets a mortgage, pays their property taxes, combined with, eventual possible upzoning. This bill did not upzone anything. The shift to larger landlords who are mostly having to use government money to get their projects built and have to rely on connections, the right government officials to get their credits approved, to get their financing approved for these projects that would otherwise be untenable in the private market without these low-income housing requirements and without these public funding. Now, that's just the Nifty 2 funding tax increment financing that we weren't supposed to know about and would not have known about if it weren't for the Resilient Rebuilding Authority. The Resilient Rebuilding Authority is the product of the LA County Blue Ribbon Commission on how to properly and safely rebuild after the fire. They engaged lots of consultants, including Hurricane Katrina disaster recovery experts, because that really went along so well. It included a lot of people who are engaged in nonprofits or in the green energy sector. And unsurprisingly, those are some of the players set to gain the most from the Resilient Rebuilding Authority. So Senator Allen, as he's made very clear in social media posts responding to my piece, and even in the comment section of my post, that he's buck passing. He's saying, look, I put this forward because LA County Board of Supervisors requested that I do it. I was just doing my job. I was just following orders. And that's why this Resilient Rebuilding Authority went in. Now, let's talk more about the Resilient Rebuilding Authority. What could it do? Well, it would use taxpayer funds to not just oversee, but actually do most of the rebuilding process. And Senator Allen's follow-up piece in the LA Times about this bill after it was canceled, which we'll talk about more later, really notes that, yes, the whole goal of this was to have the LA County buy lots, develop them and develop them, land bank them, sell completed projects back to people, or even just leave them as open space. And if you look more at the bill, it would have a lot of really just interesting and very unusual powers. It could purchase critical construction materials in bulk, manage and coordinate rebuilding and related logistics, enhance financing options, and support the reconstruction workforce by partnering with trades, facilitating training and workforce development, and creating temporary workforce housing. Notably, the bill would also, quote, facilitate reconstruction of lost rental housing stock, including by promotion of accessory dwelling units, senior serving housing, and replacement of affordable housing lost in the fires. So that last section here shows how this bill would have pretty much allowed for the funneling of all of the state and local funds. Again, earlier, this bill also says the RRA would have the full authority to issue, receive, and administer funds, including but not limited to tax increment financing, federal loans and grants, state loans and grants, and philanthropic grants to support recovery. So this money would have been able to be used to build that low-income housing that we're talking about. This is on top of $101 million that Newsom said just allocated about a week earlier before to build more low-income housing. It wasn't exactly called low-income housing. His document did say that it's for multifamily low-income housing development that will, quote, contribute to a more equitable and resilient Los Angeles, with a priority for geographic proximity to the fire perimeters of the Eaton, Hughes, and Palisades fires. So if we're bringing this back to the Resilient Rebuilding Authority, this would be a huge government agency, unclear who it's really accountable to, unclear how people would be elected to this. That would be directing possibly billions, tens of billions of dollars towards buying, building, flipping, selling property all across LA County, including in the Palisades and Altadena. And I understand why people think this might be necessary. I think especially more so for Altadena. Palisades, the land values, home prices, the comfortable weather, there's going to be enough private market demand to try to get this fixed and up and running as soon as possible. But in Altadena, the lot sales are not doing as well. Even in the Palisades, lot prices are starting to fall because you're seeing a cascade effect where a lot of people they weren't insured enough because of the state's wildfire insurance policies, which I've written about for Pacific Research Institute, regarding how there just isn't enough brush clearance down, which causes rates to be too high. But we have a popularly elected insurance commissioner who doesn't raise rates, because who's going to win an election on raising rates to keep up with rising claims from poor wildfire brush clearance policies, resulting in people just having to go to the state insurer of last resort, which was not paying them enough money to rebuild their house as it was. So people are going, okay, I don't have enough money to rebuild. This land is still worth something. I'm just going to take that money for the loss of my home and sell the lot. Turns out when a lot of people do that at the same time, you see the lot prices start to collapse. For a lot of people, the home value was their nest egg, right? If you're not working for the government and you're not super rich, even if you're middle class, upper middle class, your home is a major source of your retirement and your savings, and those values are quickly eroding. But this is even worse in Altadena, where while the Palisades was much more affluent, the Altadena still very expensive because of the Los Angeles area housing market, but it was historically much more affordable, more middle class, and there just isn't as much money to be made in the rebuilding. So we're seeing that rebuilding stall. So I can see why there would be an idea of, okay, we need to have somebody step in to help fund and accelerate this rebuilding process. Otherwise, the whole area is going to be hollowed out for years. As they've made this organization, this Resilient Rebuilding Authority, I don't think people are happy about it. And I would expect that the Resilient Rebuilding Authority would probably only apply to the unincorporated parts of LA County. I haven't spoken to Senator Allen's office about that, but we don't know what's going to happen with the bill moving forward. They'll be sure to follow up.
We'll get back to our terrific interview in just a moment, but first, PRI's YouTube channel is must watch. By visiting youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, you can watch webinars, videos, and other original content, including our new Free City Center video tours and interviews. You can watch as PRI's Wayne Weingarten tours Dignity Moves, a San Francisco nonprofit that is reimagining scalable solutions to homelessness, with founder and CEO Elizabeth Funk. And you can check out Stephen Greenhut's tour of a proposed new city in rural Solano County that has generated significant interest and intrigue. You can even listen to previous episodes of Next Round Podcast. So visit PRI's YouTube channel today at youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, and click the subscribe button to receive notifications about our latest content as soon as it's posted.
So let's talk about some of the other stories you've been covering recently. There's been a lot of news with California's high-speed rail programming in recent weeks, as the Trump administration is seeking to cut all funds from the project once and for all. Meanwhile, the Nixon administration is fighting back in court. Bring our listeners up to date. Based on your reporting, do you think high-speed rail's days are numbered, or do you think this fight is going to drag on in courts and in Congress for years to come?
I think we need to look at the broader status of even privately funded high-speed rail before we get back to the state plan. As Mark Jaffe has noted, I believe he writes for PRI sometimes. He also writes at the California Policy Center, and I think is at the Contra Costa Taxpayers Association. He's noted that even Brightline is having a hard time selling its railroad bonds for a project that will be built and is going to make money. And if even a private sector company is struggling to make money on a, compared to the California high-speed rail, relatively affordable, easy, quick to build LA to Las Vegas rail line, this larger state project is going to be in serious trouble if if it doesn't have the federal funding, state funding is limited, and the investors that it hopes are there aren't going to be there, because if they are going to invest in high-speed rail, why would they not invest in the Brightline project instead of this California 171-mile high-speed rail segment connecting Bakersfield and Merced, which isn't really a tightly populated rail corridor full of people who don't drive and who would also be willing to spend a lot of money on an expensive train ticket. It makes very little sense, especially when you see that this initial segment is going to cost $36.3 billion. We're going to spend $36.3 billion at least to maybe connect Bakersfield to Merced by 2033. As a result of the infeasibility of this, including a $7 billion funding gap on just this first segment, the Federal Railroad Administration said it's just not going to provide further federal funding for the project. So it terminates this $4 billion that was committed to the California high-speed rail project. That was effective immediately. That was about a week and a half ago on July 17th. When you read more about this project, it does get more ridiculous. The Federal Railroad Authority notes that there was no track laid. That's why the California High-Speed Rail Authority keeps talking about guideway. Guideway is not track, okay? There's no track laid, despite this project being approved by voters in 2008 to build high-speed rail connecting LA to San Francisco at a cost of about $30 billion. That just hasn't happened. And even more laughably, this initial segment of that early operating segment, again, so it's supposed to be 171 miles for the full first operating segment connecting Merced and Bakersfield. The early operating segment would be this 119-mile segment connecting Madera, which is a population of almost 70,000, and Poplar Avenue in Kern County, which is actually in the middle of nowhere. It is near Shafter, which is a small city of just over 20,000 residents that's northwest of Bakersfield. So when people are talking about a railroad to nowhere, this initial 119-mile segment could perhaps accurately be called that. Interestingly, when this was canceled, Governor Newsom tied this rail project to international geopolitical competition with China. He said, Trump wants to hand China the future and abandon the Central Valley. We won't let him. China has built a massive high-speed rail network connecting the entire nation in a matter of decades. Of course, that's done for other reasons other than getting quick ROI. They kind of just have to spend money and build infrastructure to keep their whole machine running, and they're running out of infrastructure to do and are completely overbuilt. But, that's for a different report and a different podcast. But again, it's really not clear why the state is still moving forward with this project, why they're still trying to get funding to complete this, because there's just not enough money to even operate this rail line. It's going to operate at a loss because they're not able to sell enough tickets, let alone at the price that would be required to run this very expensive high-speed train between two dense, sparsely populated areas in the Central Valley. It really makes no sense to me why we decided to go with this building the spine first. The argument, of course, was that there will be no political will to build to connect two segments that are just Bay Area and SoCal. Bay Area and SoCal, by the way, they have enough population density and there's enough travel between all those cities that high-speed rail really would make sense. I mean, I can imagine taking the train from Sacramento to San Francisco with the stop in San Jose would be extremely popular, and it'll allow people to commute from much further away, makes hybrid work in the office much easier to do for a lot more people. It could even revitalize the downtown of San Francisco and bring more people back. It's unclear why that wasn't ever pursued. The same thing goes for Southern California. Imagine being able to take a high-speed rail from even like San Bernardino to LA or Los Angeles to San Diego with a stop in Orange County. That wasn't pursued because there was a feeling that there would never be any political capital again to try to connect the two, so that they would construct the hardest section first. Unclear if that central section will ever be built, and now people are going to be allergic to funding any kind of high-speed rail, even if in some areas it actually would make a lot of sense.
So, of course, the other major story in California this year has been the recent LA ICE riots, and things have calmed down certainly in recent weeks, but there's still a lot of primarily political issues that are lingering. And we're seeing the battles are really shifting from the streets to the courtroom as the Newsom and Trump administrations sue one another over sanctuary policies. So, talk about some of these cases that are being waged in the courts. Based on your reporting, who do you think stands to come out on top, and where do you see this issue going in the coming months? Are we going to see a return of these violent protests that we've seen on the streets, or is really the courtroom going to be where these issues are being debated?
I think the most important question here is whether or not it's possible for cities or other municipalities to have sanctuary laws that supersede federal immigration law. We do have a supremacy clause in the U.S. Constitution, and that seems to be rather ironclad. I don't really see the sanctuary policy of Los Angeles standing up to federal court scrutiny. That was an issue that the Trump administration tried to push in its first term. Ultimately, we weren't able to get a finalized ruling on that, and we're going to see this case play out again. What is concerning is what might happen if such a ruling were to be put into place. We've seen the mayor say, I believe, something like 1 million residents in Los Angeles County are here illegally. I think she said that last Sunday, and that's a very high number. That's much higher than the initial estimates of about 10% that city council members were talking about earlier. And it's really unclear what would happen in that case. Is ICE going to conduct large-scale raids across the city? Is there going to be organized, perhaps even armed resistance against this? Are things going to just happen peacefully? Will people self-deport? It's very unclear what would happen in that case, but it would result in major changes. I'm very much hoping that this is resolved in the courts and whatever follows thereafter is peaceful. Given what happened in June, maybe that won't be the case. What I do expect is that we could probably see another deployment of National Guard, maybe even federal troops to protect federal assets, but a decline in disorder in the city of Los Angeles is very likely.
As we close, let's talk about one more California success story, and that's homelessness. Of course, there's some sarcasm there. You recently reported that a federal judge has ordered the selection of a third-party overseer over Los Angeles's failed homelessness programs. While we appreciate the judge's frustration, one wonders, based on California's experiences with the federal prison overseer on prison overcrowding, whether this would make things better or worse on homelessness in Los Angeles. What did the judge say, and what else did you find in your reporting?
The ruling by U.S. District Court Judge David Carter, who really has been covering most of these Los Angeles homelessness related cases, outlined a lot of the failures of the city of Los Angeles and its inability to meet with its court order agreement to provide new homeless beds by 2027. There was a lawsuit by the LA Alliance for Human Rights that in 2022 resulted in a settlement with the city of Los Angeles. This is a new interesting policy approach where you see public interest groups or other coalitions filing lawsuits to get policy outcomes where the settlement agreement is actually enforcing a policy and providing some compensation for some legal costs. And the ruling does, again, focus on the city's failure to adhere to the agreement. The ruling found that the city did not verify that contractors are providing the services that they're paid for, and that half of the new beds that the city says it created were either not open or could not be verified. So we have a lot of possible fraud going on. It could be that the city is just not able or not continuing with enforcing a lot of the accounting that's happening, but we've seen other data that shows that their programs are completely out of control in terms of costs and just limited outcomes. In 2023, I conducted an investigation. I found that LA was spending $17,009 per homeless individual per month on this Inside Safe program, which puts homeless people in hotels. Last summer, the city controller released some data showing that of the $341 million spent on this program thus far, only 2,728 people use the program. And of those, 2,700 individuals, only 30 were either reunited with their family or back on their feet in unsubsidized housing. In other words, we've had extremely poor outcomes on a lot of this money spent. Of course, costs for this program have now fallen to about $7,000 a month for just room and board, which does not include the additional, often standard supportive services. But still, that $84,000 a year that we're spending on room and board per inside safe beneficiary, and by the way, these inside safe beds count towards the 12,915 new homeless beds that LA is supposed to have under the agreement. That $84,000 for just room and board for these homeless individuals to be housed in hotels, that is more than the median household income in the city of $80,366, which usually supports a family of 3 people. And you can't help but think, is this really fair to the families that are actually paying for these policies for somebody who has a very good chance of not being from Los Angeles or not having become homeless in Los Angeles to be getting an $84,000 hotel room funded by them when regular working people are having a very hard time making ends meet as the cost of everything continues to skyrocket in this state. But going back to the ruling, it also found that the LA Homeless Services Authority, which is supposed to oversee all of the homeless spending in LA County and the city of Los Angeles, that over half of the reviews of that contracted service are provided didn't even actually include any checks on program compliance. So if they often didn't do any kind of compliance checking, and of the compliance checking that they did do, they often just didn't actually do it. And again, this is just spending that is completely out of control. Notably though, Carter's ruling did not include receivership of the city's homelessness programs. That was something that had been rumored and talked about. It was even brought up during the hearings for this, but Carter said this is a last resort after all other remedies have been exhausted, which includes, of course, having a third-party overseer to review and look at what's happening, having these regularly scheduled court hearings to review the progress and updates. But again, that we're not going to take more serious action at this time. Going back, though, to the city, Going back to the city of Los Angeles, there was nearly a $1 billion budget deficit that was narrowly avoided through significant amounts of layoffs and reduction in the police force. And as we keep going towards the Summer Olympics, as we deal with more unrest as we did during the ICE protests, seeing a reduction in force in a city where we've got half the officers per capita that Chicago and New York do, despite being so geographically spread out, which really makes that half the officers per capita feel like a lot less because they have to go farther to respond to crimes. The feeling that lawlessness in the city is not really improving is pervasive, even though some of the headline numbers seem to be going down. It's also possible that there might be less reporting, although with homicides down and homicides generally always reported, it is likely that reported crime is going down as well. But again, we're spending so much money on homelessness and we're deciding to effectively cut our police force, and residents don't seem to like the direction things are going.
So finally, as we close, talking about all of these heavy and often depressing topics today, I think we might need a drink. So we call our podcast Next Round, of course, because of our proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy over a great glass of California wine. So what wine or beer or cocktail or other beverage are you enjoying these days to take your mind off of all of these weighty subjects that you're reporting on these days?
I'm pretty partial to sake. There are different grades of sake depending on how polished the rice is. I usually go for a Junmai Daiginjo, which is a very very polished grade where they take off most of the impurities on the outside of the rice, leaving just the core. I don't have any really personal favorites that I consistently go for, but truly, I think sake is a great beverage to take the edge off the day and enjoy time with friends and family.
Well, Kenneth, I would say let's adjourn and maybe have ourselves a little bit of sake. But before we go, where can our listeners who are interested in reading your articles and following what you're doing, how can they keep tabs on what you're doing at home?
Honestly, the easiest way to keep up with my work is to visit my Twitter profile, which is Kenneth Schrupp. You just search me, I'll be there. First name Kenneth, last name Schrupp, SCHRUPP.
Great. Kenneth, thanks so much for joining us on Next Round.
Thank you for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.